Welcome everyone to our panel discussion on the 25th anniversary of the Columbine shootings. A couple of things before we get started. So on your tables there are a couple of QR codes. One of them is for attendance. Please do fill that one or click it and fill it out. It's very short form. And then at the end of the program there's another one for an evaluation. If you would please fill that one out as well. It is always a good thing to know what students think of these programs so that we can plan for future programs. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. My name is Sarah Reed. I teach history here at the Northeast campus. I will be moderating. To my left is Dr. Karen Wisely. She also teaches history here. To her left is Lisa Self, who is in our Child Development Department. To her left is Janelle Buck, who teaches psychology. And finally, last but not least, is Vanessa Steinkamp, who teaches government. So let's go ahead and get started. We thought that we would begin today's discussion with a brief history on the Columbine shootings, and Dr. Karen Wisely will give us that history. I'll pass it off to her.
Okay, thanks for coming. And on Tuesday, April 20th, 1999, in Littleton, Colorado, a suburb of Denver, two teenage boys whose names we will not say shot and killed one teacher and 12 of their fellow students at Columbine High School and injured over 20 others before taking their own lives. The shooting marked the deadliest school shooting in American history at that time. Unfortunately, it has since been surpassed more than once in that category. It wasn't the first school shooting either. That distinction is a little more complicated to designate, and we will address that later. But what made Columbine unique, however, was the absolute depravity of the shooting. The meticulous planning in order to maximize the number of casualties. Only dumb luck and thankfully poor bomb-making skills kept the death toll from reaching triple figures. The two young men who perpetrated this massacre started the morning by building bombs. They planted one in a park about 3 miles from the school, set to blow up at 11:14 a.m. and mostly do no harm. It was to be a diversion that would take the first responders away from the main event. After setting that bomb, the two arrived at the school separately. They didn't park in their assigned spots, but instead flanked the cafeteria on either side. They then walked into the cafeteria with two more large bombs inside of duffel bags set to go off at 11:17 a.m., just after the bell to begin a lunch rang. More than 600 students gathered in that cafeteria during that lunch period. The bombs, had they gone off as planned, would have killed or seriously wounded most of them. The killers strategically placed the bags in the cafeteria where they would do the maximum damage, and then walk back to their cars to wait for the big boom. They planned to shoot survivors as they exited the building, but the explosion never came. The last part of their plan would have been even more dastardly. They had planted bombs in their vehicles parked near the building where a likely command center would be set up and in close proximity to the fire lanes. Those bombs were supposed to detonate about 45 minutes after the cafeteria exploded and would kill or maim countless victims who had thought they had survived, as well as the first responders who were helping them. Instead of a bomb killing hundreds, followed by the shooting of dozens more, and ending with the death and destruction of the police, firemen, and EMTs, as well as the wounded, instead, when the bombs failed to detonate, the shooters walked into the school and tried to do as much damage as they could. They were both armed with sawed-off shotguns and 9mm semi-automatic weapons, and a variety of knives. At about 11:19 a.m., the two shooters pulled out their guns and began shooting at students sitting outside the cafeteria. They killed 3 and wounded 6 others. At 11:22 a.m., Jefferson County Sheriff's Deputy Neil Gardner, Community Resource Officer at Columbine High School, exchanged fire with one of the shooters, and the two entered the school. At 11:29 a.m., the two gunmen entered the library where 56 people were hiding. When they exited 7.5 minutes later, they had killed 10 people and wounded 12 more. The two continued to wander around, that's the library, right? Okay. The two continued to wander around the cafeteria and library area of the school, shooting into classrooms and throwing pipe bombs until 12:08, when they ended their own lives in the library. The names of the dead: Cassie Bernal, age 17, Stephen Kernau, age 14, Corey DePuter, age 17, Kelly Fleming, age 16, Matthew Kechter, age 16, Daniel Mauser, age 15, Daniel Rohrbaugh, age 15, Rachel Scott, age 17, Isaiah Scholes, age 18, John Tomlin, age 16, Lauren Townsend, aged 18, Kyle Velasquez, age 16, and William Dave Sanders, age 47. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, in an effort to make sense of the senseless violence, speculation ran wild. It was suggested that the shooters had acted in retaliation for being bullied, or they had purposely targeted athletes, minorities, and Christians. Additionally, violent video games and music were blamed for influencing the killers. None of these theories proved to be true, however. There was also criticism of the authorities. The response was too slow. They didn't enter the building soon enough. They didn't know the layout of the building. There had been signs that should have raised warning flags. We will hear more from our panel on all of these issues. The school reopened after major renovation, including the complete reconstruction of the Hope Columbine Memorial Library on August 16, 1999, just 4 months after the shooting. The day began with a Take Back the School rally. The courage displayed by the faculty, staff, students, and parents on that day is unmeasurable.
Thank you, Dr. Wisely. Now let's go ahead and get started on our questions. So the first question is for Karen. Columbine wasn't the first school shooting. When did this trend begin?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's a little more complicated to designate the first school shootings. In one sense, you could say, depending on how you want to define it, that the earliest shooting to happen on school or college property in what would become the United States was the Enoch Brown massacre in Greencastle, Pennsylvania on July 26, 1764, during Pontiac's War. However, of the 11 people killed in that incident, only 1 was shot, because, muskets. If you look up school shootings, there were quite a few in the 19th and early 20th century, but most of those were the result of arguments, targeted specific individuals, and left only 1 or 2 people dead. Then, on August 1st, 1966, a 25-year-old engineering student climbed up the clock tower at the University of Texas in Austin and shot and killed 15 people and injured 31 others over a period of 96 minutes. So I would say that was the beginning. Then there was a lull, and there had been a new uptick, let's say, in the late 1990s, 97, 98, but it was still single digits.
Until Columbine.
Until Columbine.
Okay. Thank you. My second question is going to kind of go from that, and is for Vanessa. How has Columbine changed the liberty versus security dynamic in public schools?
There's always been a dynamic where we're trying to balance liberty versus security. There are some places where we voluntarily cede some of our liberty, airports, borders, for security in return. And schools historically had erred on the side of liberty. I know when I was growing up, schools were open. Parents could come in. Like I remember my brother once walked into the gym and dropped off a lunch for me. And I think Columbine really shifted the scales of that dynamic towards security, and more so because when you look at school shootings, you have to look at prevention versus preparation. And security really focuses on that kind of preparation for school to reduce the incidence or likelihood of a school shooting, such as school personnel training. Should teachers carry, right? But even more so, school building securities. We have security vestibules, we have check-ins, we have name tags we have to all wear. And then even more so with this active shooter preparedness, with lockdowns, lockouts. And so it really shifted the scales to look at schools in a different way. Not only that students are being educated there, but the onus is on the schools to protect the students that are being educated there, which really tipped the scales more towards security and away from that liberty paradigm that I had experienced growing up.
And going off of what you just said, Lisa, can you speak more to how we perceive school safety?
Sure. As I was thinking about this and preparing for this, I thought, I think maybe this is an overstatement, but there are certainly events that change the way we look at things and change the way that the procedures that we use. And so when 9/11 happened, everything about airport security changed. And so I don't want to say this is the 9/11 for schools, but it kind of was. It really changed everything, where you did feel very safe going into schools. You didn't hear about these events that Karen was referring to, where one or two people through time because of domestic violence that ended up at a school, or an argument with a student and a teacher. You didn't hear about those things. And then once Columbine happened, it really changed how we all looked at schools and school safety, and realizing that now we do have to do that preparedness training. And now we do have to do lockdown drills. And here at TCC, our own children's center, we do lockdown drills regularly, where the 2-, 3-, and 4-year-olds are trained, and they know if the bell rings, it's a fire drill, but if it's a different signal, which has no sound, by the way, then it means you immediately go into the bathroom, lock all the doors, and you have to be quiet and all that. So it's from preschools all the way up through even colleges. It just has made a huge difference in understanding that, those bags that were sitting around that, like these days, we're like, whoa, 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 there's a bag, and nobody's with it, and so it just changed how all of us do everything. And even though many people in the room weren't even born when this happened,
Right.
it's a part of their normal lives now.
Sure.
Where we remember,
Yes.
how it was before.
And that's a good point, because like 9/11, I remember Columbine. I was I was a freshman in college, not a senior in high school. I was a freshman in college, so it was very clear in my mind. I just graduated high school, and this happened at a high school, so yeah. All right, Janelle, what is the psychological profile of a school shooter, and what motivates a school shooter?
This tends to be a little bit complicated. Right after Columbine, the FBI worked really hard to come up with a profile of a school shooter. And what they came up with had correct things on it, but too many students fit that profile. And so it ended up with students who maybe just thought a little bit differently being sort of profiled as potential shooters. So today's sort of perspective is that there is no profile for a school shooter. However, that doesn't mean we don't know anything about them. It's just what we know could apply to more than just shooters. So first thing that we know is they tend to be younger males, and they tend to be white students who return to the school where they're enrolled. So most people go to the school that they're enrolled in. They also tend to be what is often described as nihilistic, which just means like they're extremely pessimistic. They think that, there's no true values. They have sort of become sort of lost in their view of the world. They also feel like they have been wronged at school in some way. You hear people talk about bullying, and it's not so much bullying, it's more they feel either rejected or unseen. So they feel that they go back to the school because it's a place where they have been wronged in some way. But it can be a variety of different ways, not just sort of the way that is often portrayed in the media.
And in fact, when we're talking about the Columbine shooters, one of the ideas was that they had been bullied, but they were the bullies,
Right.
actually. So it was the complete opposite from what general population might have thought.
And I do always like to remind my students that we tend to think of people as bullies or people who were bullied, but very often people can play the same role. So they can be the victim of bullies and bullies themselves. And so my guess is at Columbine, there was probably a bit of a combination.
It's a good point.
Right? It's not an either-or situation most of the time.
Thank you. Karen, are school shootings happening more often since Columbine? And why are school shootings, or why do they seem deadlier than they once were?
The answer is that yes, they are happening more often, and they are getting more deadly, and part of the reason for that is the weaponry used. I mentioned in the introduction that Columbine had been the deadliest school shooting in American history at that time, but it was passed first by the Virginia Tech shooting on April 16, 2007, where a shooter killed 32 people and then himself. And then it was passed again in 2012, December 14, 2012. I'll bet most of us probably remember that one. The Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting with 26 dead. Then there's Parkland High School shooting on February 14, 2018, where 17 were killed. And then finally, Robb Elementary School shooting in Uvalde, Texas on May 24, 2022, with 21 dead. I think the things that make Sandy Hook, especially in Robb Elementary School shooting in Uvalde, a little bit more, I don't want to say more tragic, but definitely it hit a little bit harder, was that the kids in those shootings were so little. They were elementary school kids, they were kindergartners, they were fourth graders, they were little, tiny bodies that were just devastated by the high capacity, high volume rounds that were shot into them, and so it was particularly violent, particularly deadly, and particularly, unfortunately, memorable because of that.
Vanessa, how has the role of government changed since Columbine? And specifically, since we live in the state of Texas, how has Texas addressed school safety issues?
Well, I think the role of government really is the way they perceive schools and education. Really, there was a content focus when I was growing up, and it shifted it to also a safety and security focus, which I'm sure Professor Buck can speak to, creates a whole psychological dynamic as well. And I think, Texas has had its own Columbine with Uvalde that I know Dr. Wisely just spoke about. And so since then, there has been a move for the state of Texas to not only address state security, the preparation, but also the mental health prevention of it as well. Just this past biennium, they passed House Bill 3, which had a series of requirements. One of them was mental health training for staff. Another one is the Texas Education Agency allowed for more authority for themselves to make sure that school had safety plans in place. They created a chief of school safety and security to ensure compliance. They also added $1 billion dollars for grants through the TEA to just shore up to the minimum requirements. And then they'll offer a secondary offering of the $1 billion for grants to further enhance their plans. It also required SROs, school resource officers, to be embedded at every school. But there's some tension in between how much do we fortify schools and how much do we try to prevent these events from occurring. The preparation focuses on the culture of the school. How do students treat each other? How do they address bullying? I know they passed David's Law, which they are enforcing pretty judiciously. I know they also have See Something, Say Something with anonymous reporting. So these are some of the focuses. And then the other tier is the real preparation of, and you have some sort of polarization with do we want to turn schools into these fortified areas where little kids are going to learn, but yet on the forefront of their psyche, they're looking at all these evidences that you could be in a potentially dangerous place, and how does that impede learning? And so these really create kind of a quandary when you look at to combat it, when you're trying to bridge these two pieces together. I think Texas has probably, you could ask numerous people, but since Uvalde, they have enacted some reforms, which I will talk about a little bit later.
Right.
But I think that's the real crux of the issue of how much do you focus on prevention and how much do you focus on preparation, and how likely is this to happen? Is it still a black swan event? Is it something that you always want on the forefront of the kids' brains? Because does that impede them from focusing, from learning? And then how much do you ignore it? It's
Sure.
this really hard balance, I think, to grapple with. And of course, after every event, it becomes, again, another issue. And since Texas has had their own, we really have had to look inside. I think all of us, I teach in high schools because I teach dual credit, and this is something I think about. Not that it can't happen on the college campus, but at the high school level, you're going through lockdown drills. I was once in a lockout where I was stuck in the classroom with kids at a high school for 2 hours. I almost missed my college class, And so these are really hard issues, even for me, to be honest with, to grapple with myself. There is no quick fix. And a lot of the pieces are going to have to come together in a slow, consistent, continuous basis. So it is a nuanced, I think, really difficult puzzle to solve, but one that needs to. Just watching that video, I could start crying watching that video. I was student teaching at that time, and it's one of those things you never forget where you were. So
Yeah.
I think about it quite a bit.
Yeah, and I remember, you mentioned Uvalde as being sort of the Columbine for Texas. I remember after Uvalde, it was very difficult to send my child to school the next day.
Oof.
And they had increased police presence and all of those things the school district had put into place, but it does affect you mentally.
Yeah, and Sandy Hook was kind of that for me with my children. My kids were really little when Sandy Hook happened, and you're right, I just wanted to go pick them up for school.
Yeah.
And there is that impulse to do something, to do more. And really to try and ferret out emotion versus reason versus really doing something that affects change versus gives the allure of change. And how do you balance it out with the psyche of the kids that are there to learn? These are very hard problems to solve.
Sure. And since we've touched upon mental health, Janelle, is there a link between mental health and school shooters?
Well, I've been thinking about this pretty much since I've been asked to do this panel.
Sure.
And I've looked at a lot, and the answer, I think, is yes, but not in the way that people expect. So when we think about someone who could do something like the school shooters do, our minds automatically go to words like psychopath, is a strange person, different from us, things like that. And we saw that with Uvalde, like straight away. They're like, this is a psychopath who did this. We tend to do that in part because it sort of absolves us as a society from doing something, right? Because if we think that this person is just this unique bad person, then we don't have to change. We don't have to make anything like that. And in truth, we don't have evidence that these shooters do meet our criteria for psychopath, or for those of you in psychology, antisocial personality disorder. And they look, it's tricky, in part because most shooters die at the event. So we don't get a lot of information about them after the event.
Right.
But we do know prior to the event certain things. And so even when you look at the Sandy Hook shooter, which he had quite a few diagnoses before, he still does not meet the requirements for antisocial personality or a psychopath, as you would think about it. So we don't see that. But we do see that people who do school shootings are struggling with mental health. However, what they're struggling with is things that many of us struggle with. So they're very likely to be depressed. They're very likely to have anxiety. They also tend to be suicidal, right? And so you might not have thought of school shootings like this, but many of them go in expecting to not survive, right? And this is how they're thinking about the event, that they're going to kind of go out and sort of solve their problem, and how they're actually solving their personal problem is through death, right? So we see a strong link in that way, but it's not as helpful as you might think, because the vast majority of people who struggle with mental health are not going to be violent at all, little less a mass shooter. And so it gets very complicated when we look at it, because we expect to see these really extreme, serious mental health issues. We don't see them, but we do see them struggling with mental health and feeling connected to their community. They feel wronged by their school, as I mentioned before. And so it's a very complicated, and that's why the profile doesn't work, because if we're looking for teenagers who are depressed, it's going to be many teenagers. And so they try to look at other things. We do see school shooters do tend to leak the fact that they're going to do something. And so that's why they sort of work on that. If you see something, say something, because they call it kind of strangely leakage, right? So where they start to talk about their plans to people that are not involved in the plans, or they have problematic interactions with their peers. But that's why the profiles don't quite work, because teenagers have a tendency to be a bit awkward. So if we look at all of the problematic interactions with peers, it still doesn't help us really find the people who we need to be concerned about. And so we do see a link, but not in the way that people expect.
And I'm just thinking about some of the research that I did in preparation for this panel. And one of the school shooters for Columbine, one of the ideas was that he was a psychopath, and that was used as a reason behind why he did what he did. But it's interesting what you're saying, because if we evaluate him, all of the other things that you mentioned, depression, anxiety, awkwardness, leakage, I don't know that he told people what he was going to do, but he kept pretty detailed diaries. So all of those things fit. So it's interesting that you brought up those points. Thank you. Okay, my next question is for Lisa. How did Columbine impact how teachers and administrators interact with parents and families at schools? And also, how did Columbine impact how schools are built?
Sure. So obviously, one of the first things that's kind of been referred to already is it changed everything about how parents and administrators get to interact with parents. Like, excuse me, the kind of idea is now that you're not welcome. I think parents feel like they have to ask permission to have access to their kid's teacher. And I think that's evolved with the availability of email, and now that we have different ways to communicate. But I think very, very quickly they were like, oh, we need to shut all this down. And we need to find out who's coming in our schools and why, who's going on our field trips and why, what is the connection. And I think that's been a real barrier between teachers and administrators and families, because, there's kind of that idea of like, it could be anybody. Anybody could show up here mad. And when you do have a legitimate reason to be frustrated and you show up at a school, you want to be like, walking in like this, like, I'm just here to talk, because there is a suspicion, there is that idea of we need to, our number one job is to keep everybody safe. And so I think that has fractured some of those relationships that otherwise, would be stronger. But, what do they want? They want parents to drive up, the kids, tuck and roll, and the parents move on and get on with your day, right? And we just want the kids here, and that's our job. And then just the opposite when they pick up, they just want as little interaction, as few people as possible. As you probably well know, many of not just schools, but public buildings tend to have one entrance, one exit. Maybe you can exit, but you cannot come in, right? You remember all the doors. Do not let anybody in, That's for these exact same reasons. We want to know who's coming in. When I go visit schools, I have to tell them at the door, okay, this is why I'm here, okay, and there's usually two sets of doors that it takes me to get even to inside the school. And God bless every receptionist, every, school person that sits at that front desk. I think they're really brave people, because that's, that it is just that perception of it could be anybody, and we don't know. And then talking about how schools are built, it absolutely has changed how schools are built now. As far as there was a bond election just a few years ago in Birdville ISD where it literally was to change the entrances to schools, so that extra layer of security would be there, so that there was at least two doorways before the person actually gets into the school. And that's all because of this. So I think there's been so many ways that this has impacted schools and the way schools run today.
Yeah. So going off of that, Janelle, what are the mental health challenges for students and teachers who survive school shootings?
Well, school shootings are a major trauma, and I find people get a sense of what trauma is now, but it is going to have an impact on every aspect. So they have a hard time getting students coming back to school, right? You don't generally like to go back to the place where you experienced a trauma, and now it's a place that you're supposed to be educated. Lisa was just telling me, was it Columbine?
Uh-huh.
That in Columbine they found at the high school that the meal that they served that day could never be served again, right? Because there's all of these triggers for trauma that really pop up. Generally what they find for communities that have this experience is the first thing you see is a lot of grief and distress. And this, I think, makes a lot of sense. How quickly that sort of extreme emotion passes is very individual. So some people are going to be highly distressed like straight away. Some people may be calmer in the beginning, but later on are really going to experience the effects of what happened. So for a lot of students and teachers, they really need time to process all the things that are happening, the emotions. Many people are going to need help through that. And by help, I mean therapy. So this includes the teachers, the administrators, the students, really do better once they have some sort of professional people helping them process everything that happened. Even with that, we do find for the teachers, some of them don't return, right? Because it's just the trauma that they have experienced. About a third of the people who experience a school shooting do end up with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And PTSD tends to be something that takes sometimes a lifetime to work through, overcome, find ways to cope with the things that emerge from PTSD. And Stanford did a study where they just looked at the amount of antidepressants that were prescribed after these events. And most schools, it goes up by at least 20% more prescriptions for antidepressants. So we're really looking at long-term psychological struggles after experiencing a trauma like a school shooting.
And like that you mentioned post-traumatic stress disorder, because for thinking about Columbine, one of the things that I read in my research is that the principal who was there that day trying to get kids into places where they could be safe was diagnosed with PTSD, and it took him years to work through all of those things that he had experienced. So that's a great point. And also, could you speak to what effect not school shootings per se have, but just the mentality of school safety and all of these different layers of safety that go into effect? What effect does that have on teachers and students?
Right, so they do some studies, and they do ask the students, generally, are you afraid that a school shooting will happen? And we do see 60 to 70% of students say that is something that they worry about. And so, which is so upsetting, because how do you figure out who you are as a high schooler? How do you learn? How do you do all these things when in the back of your mind you have to wonder if you're safe? And we do know that students learn best when they feel safe, right? I think that makes a lot of sense. And then we do see, right now we have more sort of diagnoses of depression and anxiety in teens than we've ever seen in the past. And that's probably a very complicated set of factors, but people do talk about this as one of those factors. Like, if you don't have places where you go that you feel safe, then if you're already prone to anxiety or you're struggling with depression, that is not a good mix. And so they see it as a potential reason that our high school students, our teens, are just struggling as much as they do.
So Vanessa, back to you, and talking about school shootings in a broader sense, how has Columbine changed people's views about Second Amendment rights?
Well, I think the Second Amendment obviously is a controversial amendment when we talk about people's views. It tends to be a position issue. You're either for gun rights, you're against it. I think the move has been to make it more of a valence issue, where it's on a spectrum. In 2010, SCOTUS Supreme Court had a decision called McDonald versus U.S. There's always been this inherent tension of, is it a collective or an individual right? SCOTUS discerned that it was an individual right. And I think, just to give you some history of Texas gun laws, in 1995, Texas allowed concealed carry. In 2007, Texas allowed stand your ground laws with guns. In 2016, Texas allowed open carry. And in 2021, Texas allowed permitless carry. So as you see, I think Texas really values their Second Amendment individual right, which has created a tension when you're dealing with school safety. And there's two polarized camps. One camp that wants to look at school safety with, let's arm more people within the buildings, teachers, SROs. And the other camp that would like to control access and reduce the ability for those, and even smaller scale, 18 to 20 cannot buy a gun. If you have been flagged, red flag laws for, if you have been deemed that you have a propensity, maybe you can't buy a gun. Straw man gun laws, that you can't have somebody buy a gun, it's illegal for somebody else to buy a gun for somebody else who doesn't have the criteria to meet it. Those laws have been slower to pass through the state legislature. I think this last biennium is where there was a real push post-Uvalde to get some of these pieces of legislation through. And I think they saw some progress early on, but then it was stymied. And so I think these two camps are still really trying to hammer it out over, do you fortify and increase the people who have firearms within the school and those reducing access. And I think there's a real polarization and a battle still ensuing between those, because Texas culturally, I think, has really felt that there's a strong Second Amendment individual right
Okay.
Thank you. Can I jump in just real
Oh,
quick?
absolutely.
Just briefly, so in the research I did about what the FBI said about school shooters, a vast majority get their firearms from their home. So it's their family's firearms that are, they're using in these attacks. So that gets really complicated because they're not going and legally getting guns, but their families are. And so it's just, I don't have a solution to, it's just, they're
And
getting it
this
from their
is
own home.
Just anybody, Vanessa or Karen or anybody who wants to answer, but just recently, there were parents who were prosecuted for their role in not the school shooting itself, but their child participating in
Which
that
school
shooting.
shooting was that?
I think it was a 7-year-old that they just charged them with manslaughter for the kid being able to have access to the gun. This just happened like this week, I
Yeah.
believe.
Well,
Yes.
there was someone,
Yes.
it's been this year, but there was someone, was it in Colorado? Ohio, where the parent was, yeah.
Just sentenced, I think, 15 years.
Yeah. I don't know the answer, obviously. I think that all of you have come here to listen to answers, and we don't really have any. And I think that's the issue here. And when I was looking through the history, and we had muskets that you had to breech load through the barrel, they were still shooting each other. So I don't know that there is an answer. It is terrifying that the guns that they have now are so much more deadly. That adds to the terror of it, I think. But I don't know that there's any one law that we change and we'll be like, whew, thank goodness that's over. I don't think that this is a situation that's going to be solvable like that. I think that there's mental health issues. There's definitely maybe some gun issues with it. There's some, making schools safer issues with it. And all of this can just make you feel better or maybe not. Maybe it's just a placebo effect, like the TSA at the airport, Maybe it's just, hey, I feel better about this, even though nothing's really changed, and you still have about the same likelihood of it happening. So I don't know what the answer is, if that's.
I do know from like a different set of research, sometimes we talk about access to firearms in terms of suicide in psychology. And one of the things that they see as kids get older and they become teenagers, a lot of families who have been very careful with their firearms, kept them very controlled, they loosen those controls because teenagers, you think they know the rules, you think that, that they understand safety around firearms. So where previously families have been very careful about the storage and access to the firearms, they kind of loosen it up a little bit because the kids are older. But it's because we're, as parents, never imagining that something terrible is going to happen, such as using it as violence against someone else or against themselves. And so I know one of the things that they recommend is if you're a household with firearms, make sure and for all time keep the access very careful and be mindful of people who have access to the firearms and things like that. Which I don't think is like a great solution, but it is, at least something.
Right.
Start.
Karen, you mentioned at the beginning of this panel discussion when you were giving us the history that we weren't going to name the shooters. So my next question for you is, how can we teach students about school shootings without contributing to the glorification of school shooters?
Certainly not naming them is one step that is agreed on a lot, and not just by teachers, but sometimes news outlets as well will make that determination, because for a lot of these individuals, they leave behind, because many of them are killed in the process. They leave behind writings that basically say they're doing it for the glory, for the to make a name for themselves, and that they know that they're going to die, and that they want to be remembered forever. And so, from my perspective, that makes me want to just never say their names. And, to repeat the names of those who had died, those who were killed in these things, that is, remembering them and honoring them. So I won't, whenever I listed the most deadly school shootings, I didn't include the shooter in the number, because that's what they wanted. They wanted a big number, and I won't say that, and I won't say their names. We talk about it, and we talk about the damage that they do. There's no glorification in a school shooting, and it seems like, especially at a school, there's less of a tendency for people to want to glorify them. But I think it's important to not remember their names.
My last question is for Lisa. What impact will the 20th anniversary of the Columbine shootings have on schools today, do you think? And actually, this is for Lisa, but if any
Sure.
of you want to chime in.
Yeah. 25th.
25th, what did
Yeah,
I say?
20.
Oh,
It's all
sorry,
good.
25th. I can count.
No, it's all good.
It's all right.
And I think just to kind of follow on what Dr. Wisely said, when I was doing my research on this, which by the way, I remember this well. I was teaching kindergarten at the time, and we were opening a new school that following year. It was in April, and we opened our school in August, and it was very heavy on all of us as we were preparing to open this new school, and just thinking, could this happen? And so, but one of the things I saw is that there are folks out there that are obsessed with school shootings and with the shooters. And I think it's really important for us to just remember every day that if somebody is doing some leakage, you know what I mean, that's our responsibility to pass that along to authorities. And I think that's really important. And so as I think there'll probably be more press as we get closer to April 20th, I think we need to keep that in mind, keep our ears open, and just understand that there's people out there that do need some help. And so we don't want to just ignore that just because here it is the anniversary, and so I think that's part of it, and just be really, really aware of our surroundings, and as we move up to that, just and to, again, I love that you named the victims.
Yeah.
So that's all I got right now.
Okay. So, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I want to say, with regard to the 25th anniversary coming up and being vigilant, is what I tell my students is that, April 20th is a date that, yes, the Colorado shooting happened, but it also is Hitler's birthday, which there may or may not have been some connection to that. But the other thing is April 19th
Right.
is the anniversary of the Waco incident in 1993, and then 2 years later, the Oklahoma City bombing.
Right.
So April 19th and April 20th are very fraught with violent historical magnitude here. So I would say, watch for things. Have your eyes open. Be vigilant, because there are people who will try to celebrate that. So stay aware.
Anyone else? We will open for questions. I have to go grab a mic in the back of the room. And please do wait for me to come to you with the microphone.
I have a question. So, do I stand up? Okay. So when we know to, if you see something, speak up, say something, or report it or whatever. But I look at the school shooting that was in Detroit, Michigan, I believe, Oxford High School, the shooting there, where the teachers were suspicious of the shooter, of the behavior or whatever. And at this point, I just believe that it's not just for the parents to evaluate their child. Yes, they play a part, but if they're in school and the teachers are paying attention to the behavior, or if the behavior changes, this fellow was drawing the drawings that he made and everything, they were suspicious. Do you think that it should be some type of law or something passed for the teachers to not just to say that they're going to report it to Child Protective Services if the parent doesn't do anything, but should there be a law passed for the teachers to go and act, although this is a minor, still go and act on the behavior that they're seeing in this child, the behavior change in the child?
So a mandatory reporting law?
Like with Title IX, you mean? That kind
Yes, but with,
But
yeah.
for that, yeah. I mean, yes, I mean,
Yeah,
the problem is that what's happening is funding for schools are going, is going kind of down a little bit. Teachers, we're having a teacher shortage. So a lot of teachers are overworked and not picking up on things. Also, they are not, there have been school psychologists in every school, but now they're not so much because those cost money, and we don't have any. So there's a lot of things that, because reporting it is just the first step, right? So, there has to be some kind of response to the report, and I think that with the funding issues, that's going to be limited. What do you think?
I taught in a high school, and we are mandated reporter for certain instances.
Right.
Child abuse,
Yes.
sexual abuse, those things. You're required by law, and if you do not, and they can prove you did, you have broken the law, right? So you can get in trouble for that. And I can speak, I know when I taught high school, I have reported things before, and I think Dr. Wisely is exactly correct. It is pretty hard to ferret out. This is kind of aberrant behavior to make it to the next logical step of this student could do X, Y, or Z. And there's a lot of bureaucratic inertia because nobody wants to accuse a kid of being capable of doing some horrific, horrendous crime. So then it becomes a watch and see situation where that takes time. And I think, like Dr. Wisely have spoken, we have a funding issue, we have a personnel issue, we have, we're losing teachers by the minute. I know where my kids go to school, they're losing 2 of their student advocates right now. So I think there's a whole convergence of issues that is stymieing the ability for some of this prevention piece that I think would be perhaps the most beneficial way to combat this issue versus preparation. Like, wouldn't we rather prevent it than have to mitigate its effects when these things happen? And I just know at the high school level, teachers are juggling so much that they may even say something, but who do you tell? Do you tell the overworked social worker? Do you tell, and so all of these pieces are kind of the pie are not necessarily moving together. They're moving in various directions at various times, because I know for quite a few of the school shootings, there were some pieces that were in place, but then they weren't perfectly put in place. So you call those lapses. So how do we go and account for those? And these are multifaceted problems that don't have simple solutions.
And another issue I can foresee that we don't tend to think about is we're trying to just start at the very beginning. We need to report it, we need to do this, and we are assuming incorrectly that once that child gets help, things are going to improve, or we have good help for that child. But the behavioral health system in the United States is very dysfunctional. And so even if that child gets reported and someone does an evaluation, what's going to happen next is very unclear. And what's very likely is that they'll go back to school without any true help or guidance. And so it's not just getting it reported, it's what we do after that. And what we do after that is, it's just a mess.
All right.
You mentioned before they had machine guns and shotguns. Is there any other things a school shooter have that is a type of gun? Like, do they use other ordnance, or is that it?
No, they had, for these shooters, they started with the big bombs, but thankfully they didn't detonate for the most part. There were some partial detonation, but the big bombs did not detonate because the plan was, when there were 500-600 people in the cafeteria, to blow up these 2 bombs that would cause, it had like screws and nails and things in them, so that they would become shrapnel, and it would kill and wound a lot of people, but it would also structurally weaken the cafeteria walls, and then the library that's above the cafeteria would then collapse on top of it, and it would be just massive casualties. They were looking at with their 4-step program here, the first bombs, then the collapse of the cafeteria, then shooting the survivors as they come out, and then the last big bombs in their cars to take out the first responders and anybody who had survived all the rest of that stuff. They were planning on up to about 2,000 casualties. They had pipe bombs with them. As they were wandering through the school, they would throw pipe bombs, which were smaller and made a big bang. And I don't know that anybody was killed with the pipe bombs, but there was damage certainly done. So yeah, they had a lot of other ordnance. I don't think they used their knives at all, but other than that, the guns, the shotguns, the 9mm, and the bombs were the biggest of their arsenal.
I'm not sure if this was already addressed, but what is your opinion on teachers with open carry? Because I have a teacher, like my mom, who is a teacher, and I kind of want to know what's the general opinion of teachers being able to have guns to protect themselves.
I don't know if there is a general opinion on that. I think there are people that say there should be someone armed on the campus at all times. I think even the state of Texas, isn't there
I believe
the law is that you have to have one in every school now. Do they have to be armed or not?
you have to have an SRO. It
Okay.
doesn't have to be a teacher,
Okay,
but
yeah, but a
I
person.
think, doesn't Keller have, I need to fact check myself. I will say this, I've thought about this a lot, because I am in the high schools a lot. Normally, a school shooter is somebody who's attended that school, and somebody the teachers may know. And as a teacher myself who is not trained, I'm more trained to be around kids and help them and guide them. I wonder from a psychological perspective, I guess this is sent to you, Professor Buck, is it possible somebody who's not trained to shoot people, who sees a student come in with a gun, could you shoot them? Are there psychological implications, ethical quandaries that you go through? I don't know, honestly, the answer.
Right.
I think about it a lot. These are the things I think about. I mean, I think if somebody came into my house and was threatening my kids, could I shoot them? I would hope, but I do you know? I think, will I put myself in front of a student to save them? Yes, absolutely. I think about that all the time, right? But I think if you're going to talk about that, what is the training? What is the certification? What is the psychological, mental health that you give those teachers to even put them in that position? There's so much more than I think just arming teachers.
And even, you were right to bring up, like, if it's someone you know, if it was a student you taught or someone that you saw, it's hard. I know this is a little bit separate research for people to shoot. So even people who join the military tend to shoot high, and so they have to be trained to be more accurate. So I think given the amount of distress and trauma someone might be experiencing in the middle of a school shooting, I don't think their accuracy would be high. I know it also creates complications for police officers as they come into the school, because particularly if it's a younger teacher or if it's at a college, you don't know, is that person a shooter or is it someone who is helping? So it makes it a little more complicated. I don't have a good answer either.
And just even the logistics of, you would keep it locked in your drawer. Oh, there's a shooter in my room. Hang on just a minute. Let me go get my key. Let me go over to my lockbox. Just, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, but having someone on campus who's not a teacher or something like that, I think they're still working through some of those things. But yeah, I think there's a lot of people who are like, we just need no armed teachers, you know?
Well, and
and
I
you think, yeah, did you really think all that out? You know?
I think even with the armed SROs, Uvalde was not stopped with the
Right.
armed SRO. And, you know, I think it wasn't the only one. I think what was it, Parkland? No, it wasn't Parkland. I can't remember the other one. He's just driving around.
Yeah, that was Parkland.
It was Parkland. You know, so, and, you know, Dr. Wisely and I share a classroom, and even we have both struggled with the door, because the door is not supposed, it's supposed to close and lock, but then that means you gotta prop it open. Well, if you prop it open, does that make you more vulnerable than having the door unlocked and closed that you can quickly lock? Like, we literally have been debating this all semester, right? Like, what's the most efficacious way to secure my classroom with my students in it? Because when it's opened, because kids are gonna come and go, they gotta go to the bathroom, kids come in late, you guys know what it's like. And so these are like logistical issues that we are talking about amongst ourselves to reduce, you know, to help keep you guys safe, that aren't even that easily addressed with finite resources, right? She went and bought something that she was hoping could put on the door that could ameliorate this issue, and they don't fit, you know? So it's, I mean, we're talking macro solutions and micro solutions, and both of them have been problematic for us to even solve in the classroom level.
I would also say, just in passing, while Sarah walks, is that, you know, having more guns in the classroom, I mean, you're just introducing then also a potential for accidents to happen.
Yeah, right.
Going back to the discussion of fortifying our schools, to such a degree, should we continue to fortify our schools until more legislation is passed?
I mean, I'm happy to speak to that. So I used to teach in a high school outside the city of Chicago, and there were schools with metal detectors and whatnot. I think it was gang and gang related. I will say they were a nightmare for students to go in. I also think when you teach at the high school level, I think at the elementary level, it's pretty easy to fortify a school, one entrance in, one entrance out. I think middle school also. High school is very difficult. They have 4 or 5 access points. They leave, you know, just on my kids' campus, they go from campus to campus, and it becomes, you know, a conundrum. And I was thinking about this. One of the schools I taught at created a security vestibule. And the first day I was teaching there, I actually called the principal. I was like, you know, the security vestibule makes the school more vulnerable, because the kids swipe in through the right and the security vestibule is through the left. And when you used to walk in, they would have adults there sitting at desks kind of viewing everybody that walked in. Well, now they're kicked off to the left to the security vestibule, and I don't think a school shooter is going to go through the security vestibule. I just think they're going to find a different avenue. And so some of this fortification to me seems like the allure of safety, which really makes us a little bit more unsafe because we're under this guise of safety when we really haven't done anything. We've just made parents feel safer. And I think some of that is just to make, I mean, I laugh I don't really laugh, but I laugh as I walk in through the student entrance. I'm like, that security vestibule is just isolating the adults that can mitigate a school shooting into one isolated area where all the kids are not, So and I also think psychologically, do you want to create a prison-like environment for students to learn in? There's a lot of parents talking about, do we give them bulletproof backpacks? And what is the psychological impact of your kid having a bulletproof backpack? Like carrying that. It's so hard, and I try to, honestly, for better or for worse, I'm not trying to commandeer this, so I apologize. I try to compartmentalize it a little bit because it can really, really take part of your psyche if you don't.
I mean, I guess psychologically it's whether or not what you're doing makes people feel safe, right? Because feeling of safety, even if it's not quite as safe as we'd like, does tend to make things, a little bit better. Or whether it's just this forever reminder that you're not safe. And I don't know studies showing which one is happening. Like, you put this stuff up, do we feel like, okay, we can now learn and feel safe? Or do we think something terrible can happen at any minute? And I don't know of research that says that it goes one way or the other. I think it depends on age a little bit as well. Like, we're talking elementary schools and things like that, what the impact may be psychologically. But I can look, but I didn't see any research in preparing about that particular aspect.
You also don't want it to be performative, taking off your shoes, putting your liquids on the bench. People are going to figure out workarounds for that. Like, are you getting ahead of the problem, or are you stuck in inertia of, I don't know.
Yeah, no answers, right?
Sorry
I
about
think
that.
I think a lot of it depends on the individual, how you're going to go about things. Whether you think about it every minute of every day or you don't think about it, I think it depends on the individual. I think some people are, and some of it has to do with trauma they've gone through before, is whenever you enter a room, you're looking at all the exits and how am I going to get out of here if something goes sideways. And other people are just disassociative, like, we're all going to die someday. So just YOLO, right? I don't know. And then there's people in between those two extremes. And, we have, there's one particular room, I'm not going to mention it.
You're going to talk about
You're going to talk about it,
Nor the name that I've given it, but I went into that room and taught for an entire, several semesters until a student brought up to me that, oh, hey, this is really a super dangerous room. And I was like, oh my God, never had noticed that before, thanks. And so, now I look a little bit more, but I try not to dwell on it, because as I told that student, because he's like, how have you never seen this before? And I said, because I try to spend most of my time interacting with my students in such a way that none of them would want to come in from the parking lot and do this. So that's just how, I live with it. I don't know.
Okay, so this may be a question without an answer, but I know you talked about how there is not really a pattern we see with school shooters, but when you mentioned that April 20th was Hitler's birthday and also the anniversary of the Columbine shooting, is there a pattern that you see that people who idolize fascism are usually school shooters? Because usually young white men are the ones who idolize Hitler, and I feel like there might be a pattern there, but I'm not sure if you'd know that.
So in the research I saw, they talk more about fascination with school shooters. So in the more recent shootings, they will know everything about Columbine. They'll be very fascinated with school shooters. And when we talk about mass shooters, which are different, so there's school shooters and there's mass shooters. And mass shooters are almost always driven by hate. And so you definitely would see that there. School shooters, I think, run a little bit more complicated, but I don't know if anyone else knows more about a connection.
I don't, but I would like to note I talked about how they reopened Columbine 4 months later, and then ever since then, they have been talking about closing it and bulldozing it. And the reason isn't because the students or the faculty or the staff were having trouble with the memories and all of that, but instead it's because of all of the people who are coming to it, like it's some sort of a shrine or something, and that is problematic, I would say. So, so far they haven't bulldozed it. They're still using it, but it's a consideration that they are having to make almost every year. Like, is it worth it? All of the traffic that it creates.
You all spoke earlier about gun safety and the access to weapons, particularly in the home, tends to be what may have been found for a lot of these cases. Something that just occurred to me, and I don't know anything about this particular instrument, but with technology ever increasing and then 3D printers, and I don't know for a fact because I haven't actually seen it in one, but I understand people create weapons with them or can create. And maybe that's just a Hollywood thing, I don't know. But
No, I think
if that is a real
that's-
consideration, do you have any idea, or from your research and whatnot, as far as, is that something that would be considered as part of any legislation when it comes to gun laws, or maybe it's just more from an educational standpoint?
Isn't that ghost guns? Isn't that
Yes.
what they've called them? And aren't there like some kind
Yes.
of regulations?
I
on it?
think there has been some federal regulations. I apologize for not knowing more, but yes, I do know that guns can be made from 3D printers. And I think there has been some federal, I'd have to do a little more research, I apologize.
I don't know how expensive those things are. I'm sorry.
I don't know how expensive those types of printers are for whatever purpose they're used for. So, it's kind of I'm dating myself now, but back in the late 80s, when Gates said, they're going to have a computer on every desk type of situation, almost everybody has a home printer, regular one. I don't know where this fits in on the spectrum
I
for
think-
mass populace, or if there's even a desire.
I think there is some concern there. I think
Yeah.
that's why there has been legislation. They have talked about it. I think you're absolutely right. And I think it speaks to the larger issue of how do you get ahead of technology that is increasing ever so quickly, even faster than legislation can ever dreamed of catching up, so.
I was just wondering if there have been any, especially long-term studies about the either societal trauma or societal fascination with some of these crimes?
So I'm not particularly familiar with that. I've seen more long-term studies of people who survived school shootings, and as you may know, trauma is something that has a very lasting impact. So as we're following these people who had this experience, it's so far been kind of a lifelong issue. It improves over time, but we had that. But as far as what that means for us as society, I see people talk about it, but I haven't seen a study about what it actually means for us. And we talk about it, what I see is people talk about it in the way we talked about it. Do students feel safe at school, right? And that sort of feeling of unsafety. I do know that people today assume that we live in a world that is more violent than the world in the past. And I also know that that's not the case. And we don't have as much crime as we did in the past. But does anyone feel that way? I don't think they do. I think we think the world is just, falling apart. And I do wonder if stuff like this contributes to that, right? So that sort of societal feeling. But as far as research, I'm not as familiar with something to actually speak to you about it. Sorry.
Yeah, I haven't seen any, so I don't know. Yeah,
Can I say something real quickly? I just want to say I was a little nervous to come here to talk, just because it's such an emotional topic. Like, I remember that, like, when that video was showing, I don't know if you noticed, I had to avert my eye because I was going to start crying, and I just want to thank you guys for having so much, attention and interest in all of this, because this is not an easy topic to talk about. And I really appreciate it. As I look out there, I don't see many people on their phones. Nobody's on their phones, which is a perpetual problem. So I want to say thank you for giving this the seriousness I think this topic really does deserve. So thank you so much.
Though I do love all the knitting. I've been appreciating that.
I just want to thank my colleagues for addressing this issue. Probably 5 people on this campus, other than my students, know that I was on Timberview High School campus 3 years ago, October 6th of 2021, when that fight turned into shots fired and an active shooter on that campus. My classroom was 4 doors down from where that incident took place. I did not have a key to lock the door. And I did the next week when I returned to campus. They met me at the door with a key. This is something that has become very much a part of my life as an aftermath of that experience. And I've asked a few people if they had concerns about it, and I've not gotten a lot of response. It heartens me to know that you guys are thinking about this and talking about it, and I would like, to assist in any way I can to improve campus safety here, because it is all about making our students feel comfortable and safe and welcome, and that's hard to do all those things at one time. So thank you guys for this conversation.
I'm sorry if it's more of a statement than a question, but as far as Uvalde, sorry. Did you hear the first part?
Yeah.
Okay, just making sure. As far as Uvalde, a few years ago, I know personally in my life, I was with a mom when they experienced the loss of their child. And because of that, I know that, I think I know that there's not a word in any language for a parent that loses their child. And Abbott's response to it was, it could have been worse. I'm sure if it had been his own child, that would not have been the response. And the thing is, I feel like the Texas government and much of our American government is putting up facades that they're doing something when it is a facade, because I've worked in schools and a lot of the shooters are children who have gone to the schools. And if you're teaching all of these kids the same drills, you're teaching the potential shooter the same drill. And I know myself that if I'm being taught something, then I'm also thinking of ways to get around it. So as a grown woman, this makes me think about, is this a safe place to have children? And I just don't think our government's thinking about that when they're thinking about this generation that's not really having kids. Because I don't know, I couldn't imagine my kid going to school and not coming home. So that really wasn't a question, but it is this feeling I have very often.
Yeah, I mean, that I would think that would have to be some kind of concern, because they are basically learning the ways around it, and yeah, I don't know about not having kids. I feel like, there's a whole bunch of things that go into that decision, but I would say that, if this is the one thing stopping you from having kids, I mean, there's homeschool, there's other.
Karen, if you are about
yeah.
to leave, please do make sure to fill out the evaluation before you do that.
Yeah, the
Sorry.
other QR code says evaluation across the
Yes.
top. That would help us immensely. I would say thank you all for being here, come back for our next one, which is on the 20.